The leather-bound copy of Shakespeare's complete works nearly slipped from Victoria Kane's fingers when her sister-in-law slammed the sewing basket on the kitchen table hard enough to rattle the china plates on the shelf above. It was August of 1862 in Coloma, California, and the afternoon heat had already turned the small cabin into an oven, but the atmosphere inside had nothing to do with the weather. "Reading again," Martha Kane said, her voice dripping with contempt as she stood with her hands on her hips. "While the rest of us are mending clothes and keeping this household together, you sit there with your nose in a book like some kind of princess." Victoria carefully marked her place with a strip of faded ribbon and closed the volume, meeting her sister-in-law's glare with quiet dignity. At 21 years old, she had learned that defending herself only made things worse, but she refused to show shame for the one thing that brought her joy. She had come to live with her brother Thomas and his wife Martha 6 months ago after their parents had died of fever, and every day since had been a battle between who she was and who they expected her to be. "I finished all my chores this morning," Victoria said quietly. "The washing is done, the floors are swept, and I prepared the vegetables for tonight's supper." "That is not the point," Martha snapped, picking up a shirt with a torn seam. "A proper woman knows her place. She does not fill her head with nonsense about star-crossed lovers and Danish princes. What good will those words do you when you need to be a wife? What man wants a woman who thinks she is better than her station?" Victoria bit back the response that rose to her lips. She did not think herself better than anyone. She simply loved stories, loved the way words could transport her beyond the dusty streets of Coloma and the endless drudgery of frontier life. Her mother had taught her to read when she was 5 years old, and her father, despite being a simple farmer, had believed that education was valuable for daughters as well as sons. He had saved money to buy her books, treasuring her happiness more than the neighbors' approval. But her father was gone now, and Martha's voice was the one that filled the cabin. "I am sorry if my reading offends you," Victoria said, rising from her chair. "I will do more sewing if that is what you wish." "What I wish is for you to stop embarrassing this family," Martha retorted. "People talk, Victoria. They say you are strange. They say you are unnatural. How is Thomas supposed to hold his head up in town when his sister acts like some kind of educated fool?" The words stung, but Victoria kept her expression calm. She had heard variations of this lecture a dozen times before. She took the shirt from Martha's hands and sat down with the sewing basket, threading a needle with practiced movements. Martha watched her for a moment longer, then huffed and went back to her own work. The afternoon crawled by in tense silence. Victoria's fingers moved automatically through the familiar motions of mending, while her mind wandered through the scenes she had been reading. She thought about Beatrice and Benedict, their witty exchanges and hidden affections, and wondered if she would ever find someone who appreciated her sharp mind rather than resented it. When Thomas came home that evening, covered in dust from working at the lumber mill, Martha wasted no time complaining about Victoria's behavior. Thomas listened with a weary expression while he washed his face and hands in the basin by the door. "She is family, Martha," he said finally. "And she does her share of the work. If reading makes her happy in the evenings, I do not see the harm." "The harm is that no decent man will marry her if she keeps acting so peculiar," Martha shot back. "She is 21 years old, Thomas. Most women her age are already married with children. But she sits there with her books instead of trying to be pleasant and agreeable." Victoria felt her cheeks burn. She focused on cutting potatoes for the stew, keeping her eyes down while they discussed her as if she were not in the room. "Perhaps we should take her to the dance at the church next Saturday," Thomas suggested. "Give her a chance to meet some people." What good will that do when she would rather talk about books than smile and be charming? Martha muttered, but she agreed to the plan with a resigned sigh. The following Saturday, Victoria found herself squeezed into her best dress, a simple blue cotton frock that Martha had grudgingly helped her press. The church hall was crowded with people from Coloma and the surrounding ranches, the air thick with the smell of candle wax and ladies' perfume. A small group of musicians tuned their instruments in the corner while young women clustered together, giggling and casting hopeful glances at the men gathered near the refreshment table. Victoria felt distinctly out of place. She stood near the wall, trying to look invisible while Martha dragged Thomas around the room to greet their friends and neighbors. She caught fragments of conversation, gossip about whose crops were failing and which rancher had bought new cattle, but none of it interested her enough to join in. "That is her," she heard a woman whisper to her companion. "The Kane girl who is always reading. My husband saw her sitting by the river with a book last week instead of attending the quilting circle." "How strange," the other woman replied. "What kind of woman prefers books to proper company?" Victoria pretended not to hear, though the words settled like stones in her chest. She was considering slipping outside for some air when the church door opened and a group of cowboys walked in, bringing with them the smell of leather and open spaces. She noticed him immediately, though she could not have said why. He was tall, with dark hair that needed cutting and a strong jaw shadowed with stubble. Unlike many of the other men who had dressed in their Sunday best, he wore clean work clothes and a worn leather vest, as if he had come straight from the range with only a quick stop to wash the worst of the trail dust away. He moved with an easy confidence, nodding to a few acquaintances but not rushing to join any particular group. His eyes scanned the room and landed on her. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the crowded hall. Then someone called his name and the connection broke. "That is Vaughn Wallace," a voice said beside her. Victoria turned to find Emily Porter, one of the few women in town who had ever been kind to her. Emily was a widow who ran the general store, and she had a reputation for speaking her mind. "He works for the Double R Ranch outside of town. Good man, from what I hear, though he keeps to himself mostly." "I do not know him," Victoria said, trying to sound disinterested. "Well, he is looking at you like he would like to change that," Emily observed with a small smile. Before Victoria could respond, the music started and couples began moving onto the dance floor. Martha appeared at her elbow, hissing instructions about smiling and being agreeable, then disappeared again into the crowd. Victoria stood awkwardly, watching the dancers and wishing she could be anywhere else. "Excuse me, miss." The voice was deep and warm, with a slight roughness that suggested years of shouting orders over the noise of cattle drives. "Would you care to dance?" Victoria looked up to find Vaughn Wallace standing in front of her, his hat in his hands. Up close, she could see that his eyes were a striking blue-gray, like storm clouds over the mountains. He looked nervous, which somehow made her feel a little braver. "I am not very good at dancing," she admitted. "Neither am I," he said with a slight smile. "But I figure we can stumble around together and at least look like we are trying." Despite herself, Victoria laughed. She accepted his offered hand and let him lead her onto the floor. He was right that neither of them was particularly skilled, but he was patient when she missed steps and did not seem to mind when she accidentally trod on his foot. "I am Vaughn Wallace," he said as they moved through a simple waltz. "I work as a ranch hand at the Double R." "Victoria Kane," she replied. "I live with my brother and his wife here in town." "I know who you are," he said, and when she stiffened, he added quickly, "I have seen you by the river sometimes, reading. I always wondered what kinds of stories could make someone look so content." Victoria was not sure what to say to that. Most people who mentioned her reading habit did so with disapproval or mockery, but Vaughn's tone held only genuine curiosity. "All kinds of stories," she said finally. "Adventures, romances, histories. Anything that takes me somewhere different." "Must be nice," he said thoughtfully. "Being able to go places without leaving home." The dance ended too soon. Vaughn thanked her politely and stepped back, but she caught him looking her way several times throughout the rest of the evening. She danced with a few other men at Martha's insistence, enduring their awkward small talk and wandering hands, but none of them made her feel the way those few minutes with Vaughn had. On the ride home, Martha was full of opinions about who Victoria should have smiled at more and which conversations she should have handled differently. Victoria listened with half an ear, her thoughts still on a pair of storm-gray eyes and a voice that had spoken about her reading without judgment. The next few weeks passed in the usual rhythm of household chores and quiet evenings with her books. Victoria tried not to think about Vaughn Wallace, told herself it was foolish to read anything into one kind conversation, but she found her mind wandering to him anyway. She wondered what he did on the ranch, whether he liked his work, what he thought about during the long hours riding the range. She got her answer on a Wednesday afternoon in early September when she walked to the general store to buy thread for Martha. Emily Porter greeted her with a knowing smile. "You have an admirer," Emily said without preamble, nodding toward the back of the store where Vaughn was examining a display of tools. "He has been in here 3 times this week, always finding some excuse to ask if you have been by." Victoria felt her heart skip. "He asked about me." "Wanted to know when you usually came to town," Emily confirmed. "I told him Wednesdays and Saturdays, generally. Seems he found a reason to need supplies on a Wednesday." Before Victoria could decide how she felt about that, Vaughn turned and saw her. He set down the hammer he had been holding and walked over, looking almost shy. "Miss Kane," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Good to see you again." "Mr. Wallace," she replied, acutely aware of Emily watching them with interest. "I was wondering," he began, then paused as if gathering courage. "I know this might be forward, but I was wondering if you might like to take a walk sometime. Maybe down by the river if you had some free time on a Sunday afternoon." Victoria's first instinct was to say yes immediately, but years of Martha's lectures made her hesitate. Proper young ladies did not go walking alone with men they barely knew. But then again, proper young ladies also did not sit reading by the river when they should be at quilting circles, and she had never been very good at being proper. "I would like that," she said, making her decision. "This Sunday after church." The smile that lit up his face made something warm bloom in her chest. They agreed on a time and place, and then he tipped his hat again and left the store, leaving Victoria standing there feeling like the world had suddenly become more interesting. Emily laughed softly. "That man has been working up the courage to talk to you for weeks," she said. "I think he is smitten." "You barely know him," Victoria protested, but she could not keep the smile off her face. "I know he comes from good people," Emily said. "His father was a rancher up north before he died, left Vaughn and his brother to make their own way. Vaughn has been working at the Double R for about 3 years now, saving money to buy his own place someday. He is honest and hardworking, and he does not drink or gamble his wages away like some of the hands do." Victoria absorbed this information, grateful for Emily's knowledge of everyone in the territory. She bought her thread and walked home in a daze, already wondering what she would wear on Sunday and what they would talk about during their walk. Martha's reaction to the news was predictably mixed. On one hand, she was pleased that Victoria was finally showing interest in a man. On the other hand, She worried that Vaughn was just a ranch hand with no real prospects. "A cowboy," Martha said with a sniff. "Well, I suppose it is better than ending up an old maid. But you should not seem too eager, Victoria. Make him work for your affection or he will not value it." Victoria nodded and agreed to everything Martha said, but privately she had no intention of playing games. She liked Vaughn's directness, the way he had simply asked her what he wanted to know instead of dancing around it. She wanted to be equally honest with him. Sunday took forever to arrive. Victoria sat through the church service, barely hearing a word of the sermon, too focused on the knowledge that Vaughn was somewhere in the congregation behind her. When the final hymn ended, she had to force herself to walk calmly out of the church instead of rushing. He was waiting by the big oak tree at the edge of the churchyard, looking scrubbed and nervous in a clean shirt. Victoria had worn her best dress again, the blue one, and had taken extra care with her hair. "You look lovely," he said when she reached him. "Thank you," she replied, feeling her cheeks warm. "You look very nice as well." They walked together toward the river, maintaining a respectable distance while still being close enough to talk easily. For the first few minutes, they made polite conversation about the weather and the church service, both of them clearly nervous. But as they reached the riverbank and began following the path that wound through the cottonwoods, the conversation became more natural. "Can I ask you something?" Vaughn said after a while. "Why do you like reading so much? I mean, I know lots of people who can read, but you seem to really love it." Victoria considered her answer carefully. "I suppose it is because books let me see the world through different eyes," she said. "I can be a queen in England or an explorer on the ocean or a woman in ancient Rome. I can learn about places I will never go and people I will never meet. It makes the world feel bigger and more full of possibilities." Vaughn listened with an intent expression, as if her words actually mattered to him. "I wish I could read like that," he said. "I can manage simple things, signs and short letters, but I never learned proper reading. My mother died when I was young and my father needed me working on the ranch. There was not much time for schooling." "That must have been hard," Victoria said softly. He shrugged. "It was just how things were, but sometimes I wonder what I missed, you know. I see you with your books, and you get this look on your face like you are somewhere wonderful, and I think that must be nice." They found a fallen log near the water and sat down, watching the river flow past. Victoria felt an impulse that surprised her with its intensity. "I could teach you," she offered. "If you wanted to learn, we could meet sometimes and I could help you practice reading." Vaughn turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. "You would do that? Spend your time teaching a cowboy his letters?" "You are not just a cowboy," Victoria said firmly. "You are someone who wants to learn, and that matters more than anything else." Something shifted in his face, a mixture of gratitude and something deeper that made Victoria's breath catch. "I would like that very much," he said quietly. "But I do not want to impose on your time. I know you must be busy with your family." "I would enjoy it," Victoria assured him. "Honestly, it would give me something to look forward to." They agreed to meet twice a week in the early evenings, when Vaughn's work at the ranch was done and before it got too dark to see. Victoria would bring books, and they would work on his reading together. It would have to be kept quiet, of course, because Martha would certainly have opinions about the propriety of such arrangements, but they would be careful. The next few weeks fell into a pattern that made Victoria happier than she had been in years. Twice a week, she would slip away to meet Vaughn by the river, bringing whatever book she thought would interest him. They started with simple children's primers she borrowed from the schoolteacher, then gradually worked up to more complex texts. Vaughn was a dedicated student. He practiced the words she taught him during his long days on the range, sounding them out in his head while he rode fence lines and herded cattle. His progress was slow but steady, and Victoria found teaching him to be deeply satisfying. More than that, she enjoyed the time they spent together, the easy conversations that flowed between lessons. He told her about growing up on his father's ranch, about learning to ride before he could properly walk and understanding cattle like they were his own language. He spoke about the freedom of the open range, the satisfaction of hard work well done, and his dream of someday owning his own land. She told him about her childhood, about parents who had valued learning and kindness over social convention. She spoke about the loneliness of living with Martha, the constant criticism, and the feeling of never being good enough. She shared her own dreams, vague and uncertain though they were, of a life where she could be herself without apology. "Your sister-in-law sounds like a difficult woman," Vaughn observed one evening after Victoria had recounted another of Martha's lectures about proper feminine behavior. "She means well," Victoria said, though the defense was half-hearted. "She wants what is best for me. Does she?" Vaughn asked quietly. "Or does she want you to fit into her idea of what you should be?" The question struck something deep in Victoria's heart. No one had ever challenged Martha's intentions before, had ever suggested that her constant criticism might be more about control than care. "I do not know," Victoria admitted. "Sometimes I feel like I am disappointing everyone just by being myself." Vaughn reached out and took her hand, the gesture gentle but deliberate. It was the first time he had touched her outside of helping her over rough ground or handing her a book, and the warmth of his calloused palm against hers sent a shiver through her. "You could never disappoint me," he said, his storm-gray eyes serious. "I think you are remarkable exactly as you are." Victoria felt tears prick her eyes. She had not realized how desperately she needed to hear those words until he spoke them. "Thank you," she whispered. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, hands still joined, watching the last light fade from the sky. When they finally stood to head back to town, Vaughn kept hold of her hand a moment longer. "Victoria," he said, then paused as if choosing his words carefully. "I know I am just a ranch hand without much to offer, but I care about you, more than I have ever cared about anyone. And I would like to court you properly if you would allow it." Victoria's heart soared. "I care about you too," she said. "And I would very much like that." He smiled then, a full genuine smile that transformed his serious face, and Victoria felt herself falling even deeper. They agreed that he would speak to Thomas to ask formal permission to court her, though they both knew Martha would have plenty to say about it. The conversation with Thomas and Martha happened the following evening. Vaughn came to the cabin after supper, hat in hand and clearly nervous. Martha answered the door and her eyes narrowed when she saw who it was. "Mr. Wallace," she said coolly, "what brings you here?" "I would like to speak with Mr. Kane if he is available," Vaughn said politely. "It is a matter of some importance." Thomas came to the door, looking curious, and invited Vaughn inside. Victoria pretended to be busy with the dishes, but her hands were shaking as she listened to Vaughn explain his intentions. "I would like your permission to court your sister," Vaughn said directly. "I know I am not wealthy, and I cannot offer her an easy life. But I am hardworking and honest, and I give you my word that I will treat her with the respect and care she deserves." Thomas looked at Victoria, who met his eyes with a pleading expression. Her brother had always been kinder than his wife, more willing to let Victoria make her own choices. "What do you think, Victoria?" Thomas asked. "Is this what you want?" "Yes," she said firmly. "Very much." Martha made a noise of frustration. "Thomas, we should discuss this privately." "Victoria, why do not you walk Mr. Wallace to the door?" But Thomas shook his head. "I do not think there is much to discuss, Martha. Victoria is of age to make her own decisions, and if she wants Mr. Wallace to court her, I see no reason to object." Vaughn's relief was visible. He thanked Thomas profusely and promised to call on Victoria properly from now on. As he left, he caught Victoria's hand for just a moment and squeezed it, his eyes full of warmth. The moment the door closed, Martha launched into a tirade about foolish girls and poor prospects, and how Victoria was throwing away her chances at a decent marriage. Thomas listened for a while, then finally cut her off. "Martha, enough," he said tiredly. "Victoria is happy, and Wallace seems like a good man. That is all that matters." Victoria could have kissed her brother for his support. That night, lying in her narrow bed, she allowed herself to dream about a future with Vaughn, about a life where she could read and learn and be herself without judgment. The next few months were the happiest of Victoria's life. Vaughn called on her twice a week in the evenings, and they spent hours talking and reading together. She introduced him to Shakespeare and Dickens, to poetry and philosophy, and he soaked it all up like dry ground after rain. His reading improved dramatically, and soon he was able to work through entire passages on his own. But more than the reading lessons, they simply enjoyed being together. Vaughn told her stories about the ranch, about difficult calvings and stampedes narrowly avoided, about sleeping under the stars and waking with frost on his bedroll. Victoria shared her thoughts on the books they read, and Vaughn listened with genuine interest, asking questions and offering his own interpretations. They went on walks when the weather allowed, explored the hills around Coloma, and attended church socials together. The town gossips had plenty to say about the bookish Kane girl and the quiet cowboy, but for once Victoria did not care what anyone thought. She was happy, truly happy, and that was worth any amount of whispered criticism. Martha remained disapproving, but seemed to realize she was fighting a losing battle. She contented herself with making pointed comments about how Victoria should be learning more practical skills, instead of spending all her time reading with Vaughn. One evening in late November, as they sat together in Thomas and Martha's parlor with a volume of poetry open between them, Vaughn suddenly set the book aside and took both of Victoria's hands in his. "I have to tell you something," he said, his expression serious. "The foreman at the Double R is retiring next spring, and the owner has offered me his position. It comes with better pay and a small house on the ranch property." "Vaughn, that is wonderful," Victoria said, genuinely pleased for him. "You have worked so hard for this." "It also means I could afford to support a wife," he continued, his voice slightly rough with emotion. "Victoria, I know we have not been courting very long, but I am certain about my feelings. I love you. I love your intelligence and your kindness and the way you see the world. I love that you taught me to read and never made me feel foolish for not knowing. I love everything about you, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold ring. "This was my mother's. It is the only thing I have from her. Would you marry me, Victoria? Would you come live at the ranch and be my wife?" Victoria felt tears streaming down her face, but they were tears of joy. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, Vaughn, I will marry you. I love you so much." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her for the first time, a sweet, gentle kiss that promised years of love and companionship. Martha was less than thrilled when they announced the engagement, worrying about Victoria living so far from town and married to a man who was, in her view, beneath their station. But Thomas was happy for his sister, and that was enough. They were married in early March of 1863, in a simple ceremony at the church with Emily Porter, and a few of Vaughn's friends from the ranch in attendance. Victoria wore a new dress that Emily had helped her sew, pale yellow cotton with lace at the collar, and she carried wildflowers that Vaughn had picked that morning. As they stood before the minister and spoke their vows, Victoria felt a sense of rightness settle over her. This was where she was meant to be, standing beside this good man who loved her exactly as she was. The ranch house was small but sturdy, a two-room cabin with a stone fireplace and windows that looked out over rolling hills. It was miles from town, surrounded by grassland and cattle, but Victoria found she did not mind the isolation. In fact, she loved the peace and quiet, the sense of space and freedom. Vaughn carried her over the threshold that first night, both of them laughing and nervous. He had made sure the house was clean and ready, had even picked more wildflowers to put in a jar on the table. "Welcome home," he said softly, setting her down in the main room. Victoria looked around at the simple furniture, the stone fireplace, the shelves Vaughn had built specifically for her growing collection of books. "It is perfect," she said, meaning it completely. That night, as they lay together in their marriage bed, Vaughn traced the lines of her face with gentle fingers. "I still cannot believe you chose me," he said quietly. "A woman as smart and beautiful as you could have had anyone." "I chose you because you are the only one who ever looked at me and saw who I really was," Victoria replied. "Because you never tried to change me or make me feel less than. Because you asked me to teach you to read and made it feel like a gift instead of a burden." He kissed her then, deeply and thoroughly, and they made love for the first time with tenderness and passion. Afterward, as they lay tangled together, Vaughn ran his hand over the books stacked on the bedside table. "Will you read to me?" he asked. "I mean, I know I can read on my own now, but I love hearing your voice, the way you bring the words to life." Victoria felt her heart swell with love. She reached for the book on top, a collection of adventure stories, and settled back against the pillows. Vaughn rested his head on her shoulder, one arm around her waist, and she began to read. It became their nightly ritual. No matter how tired they were from the day's work, they would climb into bed and Victoria would read aloud while Vaughn listened. Sometimes he would interrupt with questions or comments, and they would discuss the story together. Other times he would simply listen, his breathing slow and steady against her side. Life on the ranch was harder than Victoria had expected, but also more rewarding. She learned to cook over the fireplace, to tend a vegetable garden, to care for chickens and preserve food for the winter. Vaughn was patient with her mistakes and celebrated her successes, and slowly she became competent at the practical skills Martha had always said she lacked. But she never stopped reading. Vaughn made sure of that, defending her right to spend time with her books even when ranch neighbors suggested she should be doing more useful work. When the wife of another ranch hand made a snide comment about Victoria wasting time reading when she could be sewing, Vaughn's response was swift and firm. "My wife's mind is as valuable as her hands," he said coolly. "And in our house, we value learning and education. If that seems strange to you, I suggest you keep your opinions to yourself." Victoria had never loved him more than in that moment. The first year of their marriage flew by in a blur of hard work and deep happiness. Vaughn excelled as foreman, earning the respect of the ranch hands and the owner alike. Victoria transformed their little house into a home, filling it with books and plants and small touches that made it uniquely theirs. In the evenings, after supper was done and the animals were tended, they would sit together by the fire. Sometimes Victoria would read aloud while Vaughn worked on repairing tack or other small tasks. Sometimes they would read silently, each absorbed in their own book but comforted by the other's presence. And sometimes they would simply talk, sharing their thoughts and dreams and stories. Victoria discovered that she loved the ranch life more than she ever expected. She loved the vast open spaces, the way the sunrise painted the hills gold, the sound of the wind through the grass. She loved watching Vaughn work, the confidence and skill with which he handled horses and cattle. She loved the sense of building something together, of creating a life that was entirely their own. In the spring of 1864, Victoria realized she was pregnant. She told Vaughn one evening after supper, nervous about how he would react. They had talked about children in abstract terms, but the reality was suddenly very immediate. Vaughn's face went through a series of emotions so quickly she could barely track them all. Surprise, joy, fear, and then a fierce protectiveness that made her eyes sting with tears. "A baby," he said wonderingly, placing his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "We are going to have a baby. Are you happy?" Victoria asked. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," he said, pulling her into a tight embrace. "I am terrified and thrilled and so grateful I can barely stand it." The pregnancy was difficult at times. Victoria suffered from terrible nausea in the early months, and the summer heat was oppressive. But Vaughn was endlessly patient and supportive, taking on extra work around the house so she could rest and making sure she had everything she needed. On a cold November evening, after hours of labor attended by the ranch owner's wife who had experience with births, Victoria delivered a healthy baby boy. They named him James after Vaughn's father, and the moment Vaughn held his son for the first time, Victoria saw tears streaming down his weathered face. "He is perfect," Vaughn whispered, cradling the tiny bundle with infinite care. "You are perfect. Thank you for giving me this, Victoria. Thank you for everything." Those first weeks with a newborn were exhausting and overwhelming, but they navigated them together. Vaughn would walk the floor with James when he cried at night, would change diapers and rock the baby to sleep so Victoria could rest. He was a natural father, patient and gentle despite his rough exterior. When James was about 6 weeks old, Victoria tentatively suggested resuming their nightly reading ritual. She missed it, missed the quiet intimacy of sharing stories at the end of the day. "I would love that," Vaughn said immediately. "I have missed it too, missed hearing your voice, the way you make the words come alive." So they adjusted their routine. After James was fed and settled, they would climb into bed and Victoria would read while Vaughn held her close. Sometimes the baby would wake and need attention, interrupting the story, but they did not mind. It all felt like part of the same beautiful whole, this life they were building together. As James grew from an infant into a curious toddler, he would often join their reading time. Victoria would adjust her selections to include children's stories, and James would sit between them, looking at the pictures while she read. Vaughn would point out words and letters, teaching his son the same way Victoria had taught him. "This is an A," Vaughn would say, tracing the letter with his finger. "And this is B. Someday you will be able to read all these words yourself." Victoria watched her husband teaching their son with a heart full to bursting. This was everything she had ever wanted and more than she had ever dared to dream. A partner who valued her mind as much as her heart, a child who would grow up knowing that learning was precious, a home where books were treasured instead of scorned. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and small joys. Vaughn continued to excel as foreman, and his reputation as a fair and skilled cattleman spread throughout the region. He was offered positions at larger ranches with better pay, but he always turned them down. He had his eye on a piece of land about 5 miles from the Double R, a stretch of good grazing ground with a creek running through it. "Someday that is going to be ours," he would tell Victoria, pointing it out when they rode past. "Someday I am going to buy that land and we will have our own ranch. Wallace Ranch, with cattle bearing our brand." Victoria believed him. She had learned that when Vaughn set his mind to something, he made it happen through sheer determination and hard work. He saved every penny he could spare, kept meticulous records of his finances, and planned for their future with careful precision. When James was 3 years old, Victoria found herself pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and in the spring of 1868, she delivered a daughter they named Sarah, after Vaughn's mother. James was fascinated by his tiny sister, wanting to help with everything from changing her clothes to feeding her. Their little house felt full to bursting with love and life. Vaughn built an addition, adding another bedroom so the children would have their own space as they grew. He also built more bookshelves, because Victoria's collection had continued to expand. Emily Porter would save books for her when traveling merchants passed through Coloma, and Vaughn would surprise her with new volumes whenever he could afford it. "Another book," Martha said disapprovingly on one of her rare visits to the ranch. "Victoria, your house is overrun with them." "Where will you put them all?" "Vaughn will build more shelves," Victoria said calmly, refusing to be drawn into an old argument. She had long since stopped caring what her sister-in-law thought about her reading. Martha sniffed. "Well, at least you seem to be managing the household well enough. Though I still think you spend too much time with your nose in those pages instead of focusing on more important matters." "Reading is important," James piped up, coming to his mother's defense with the fierce loyalty of a young child. "Papa says smart people read books." "Are you not smart, Aunt Martha?" Victoria had to hide her smile at Martha's outraged expression. She was proud of her son's quick mind and even quicker tongue, both of which reminded her very much of herself at that age. After Martha left, Vaughn pulled Victoria into his arms and kissed the top of her head. "That boy is definitely yours," he said with amusement. "He is going to be a handful when he gets older." "He gets his stubbornness from you," Victoria teased. "Fair enough," Vaughn agreed. "But his love of words, that is all you." By the time Sarah was 2 years old, Vaughn had finally saved enough money to make an offer on the land he had been coveting. The owner, an aging rancher ready to retire, accepted Vaughn's terms, and suddenly they owned 160 acres of prime grazing land. The transition from foreman to ranch owner was both exciting and terrifying. They would have to build a new house, buy cattle, hire hands to help with the work. It would take every penny they had saved and then some, but Vaughn was confident they could make it work. "We will build it together," he told Victoria as they stood on their new land, watching the sun set over the hills. "Everything we have built together. This will be no different." They broke ground on the new house that spring. It was larger than their cabin at the Double R, with proper bedrooms for the children and a spacious main room with an entire wall dedicated to bookshelves. Vaughn designed it himself, making sure every detail was exactly right. "This wall gets the best light in the morning," he explained, showing Victoria where her books would go. "I thought you might like to read here while you have your coffee, before the children wake up and the day gets busy." Victoria felt tears in her eyes. After all these years, he still thought about her comfort and happiness in such specific and loving ways. "It is perfect," she said. "You are perfect." "Far from it," Vaughn said, pulling her close. "But I try to be the husband you deserve." They moved into the new house in the fall of 1870, just before Sarah's 3rd birthday. James was almost 6 now, old enough to help with simple chores around the ranch. He loved following his father everywhere, learning about cattle and horses and the rhythms of ranch life. but he also loved books as much as his mother did. Every night, the whole family would gather in the main room after supper. Victoria would read aloud while Vaughn worked on ranch accounts or repaired equipment, and the children would listen with rapt attention. Sometimes James would practice his own reading, sounding out words from his primer while Victoria helped him with the difficult parts. One evening, after the children were in bed, Vaughn pulled out a letter he had received earlier that day. "The territorial governor is establishing public schools in some of the larger towns," he said, "including Coloma. They will need teachers." Victoria looked at the letter with interest. "That is wonderful news. Education should be available to everyone, not just those whose families can afford private tutors." "I was thinking," Vaughn said carefully, "that you might be interested in teaching there. You are better educated than most, and you have experience teaching children." "Our children and me," he added with a smile. "You could make a real difference, Victoria." The idea appealed to her more than she expected. She loved reading to her own children, loved watching their minds open to new ideas and stories. The thought of doing that for other children, especially those who might not have access to books at home, was deeply satisfying. "What about the ranch?" she asked. "And the children?" "We will hire a woman from town to help with Sarah during the day," Vaughn said. "James will be in school anyway. And the ranch will be fine. I can handle the work, especially once we hire another hand or two." They talked late into the night, weighing the pros and cons, discussing the practicalities. In the end, Victoria decided to apply for the teaching position. She was interviewed by the school board in Coloma, and despite some initial skepticism about a woman teaching older children as well as young ones, they were impressed by her knowledge and her passion for education. She started teaching in the spring of 1871, and it was one of the most rewarding experiences of her life. Her students ranged from 6-year-olds just learning their letters to teenagers who had never had the opportunity for formal schooling. She taught reading and writing, arithmetic and history, and tried to instill in all of them a love of learning. Some of the parents grumbled about her methods. She assigned homework that they thought was too difficult, encouraged girls to pursue education with the same vigor as boys, and filled her classroom with books that she insisted the students read and discuss. But the children thrived under her instruction, and soon even the skeptical parents had to admit that their sons and daughters were learning more than they ever had before. Vaughn was enormously proud of her accomplishments. He would ride into town with her in the mornings, dropping her at the schoolhouse, before heading to the general store or the bank to conduct ranch business. In the evenings, they would ride home together while she told him about her day, about the student who finally understood fractions or the girl who wrote a beautiful essay about her family. "You were meant to do this," Vaughn said one evening as they rode home in the golden light of sunset. "You were meant to share your love of learning with others. I am so proud of you, Victoria." Their life had found a beautiful balance. Victoria taught 4 days a week, spending the other days at the ranch helping with the household and spending time with the children. Vaughn's ranch was thriving, the cattle herd growing each year. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable and happy, and every night, without fail, they maintained their ritual. After the children were asleep and the day's work was done, Victoria and Vaughn would climb into bed and she would read aloud. It did not matter how tired they were or what challenges the day had brought. Those quiet moments with a book and each other had become the foundation of their marriage. Sometimes Vaughn would fall asleep mid-chapter, his head on her shoulder and his breathing deep and even. Victoria would mark their place and set the book aside, then lie awake for a few minutes just looking at him. This man who had seen past her quirks and oddities to the person beneath. who had asked her to teach him to read, and in doing so had taught her what it meant to be truly loved and accepted. In the summer of 1873, Victoria discovered she was pregnant again. It was unexpected, as Sarah was already 5 and they had thought their family was complete. But the news brought joy rather than concern. James was almost 9 now, old enough to be a real help around the ranch, and Sarah was excited at the prospect of a baby sibling. This pregnancy was harder than the previous 2. Victoria was older now, and the physical demands took a greater toll. She had to give up her teaching position temporarily, much to her disappointment, but the school board promised to hold it for her until she was ready to return. In March of 1874, Victoria delivered twin boys. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when the midwife feared for both mother and babies. But Victoria was strong, and finally, just before dawn, 2 healthy sons made their entrance into the world. They named them Thomas after Victoria's brother and William, a name they both simply liked. Vaughn was overwhelmed, staring at the 2 tiny infants with an expression of wonder and slight panic. "Twins," he kept saying. "We have twins. And James and Sarah. That is 4 children, Victoria." "I can count," she said tiredly but with a smile. "Are you complaining?" "Never," he said immediately, kissing her forehead. "I would have a dozen children with you if that is what fate had in mind. But twins, Victoria, how are we going to manage twins?" They managed, though those first months were exhausting. James and Sarah helped as much as children their age could, and Vaughn hired a young woman from town to come help with the household during the day. At night, Vaughn and Victoria would take turns walking the floor with whichever baby was crying, sometimes both of them up at the same time with an infant in their arms. But even in the midst of the chaos, they found moments for their reading ritual. Some nights it was just a page or 2 before exhaustion claimed them. Other nights, one twin would sleep while the other fed, and Victoria would read one-handed while nursing. Vaughn would lie beside her, listening to her voice and watching her with an expression of such love it made her heart ache. "You are amazing," he would tell her. "The way you handle all of this, the children and the house, and still find time to read. You are the strongest person I know." "I learned from the best," she would reply, thinking of all the ways Vaughn had supported her over the years, all the times he had defended her right to be herself. As the twins grew and the household settled into a new normal, Victoria was able to return to teaching. She went back to the schoolhouse when Thomas and William were about 18 months old enough to be left with the hired help without too much worry. It felt good to use her mind in that way again, to engage with ideas and knowledge beyond the domestic sphere. James was now one of her students, a bright boy who excelled at every subject she taught. He had his father's work ethic and his mother's love of learning, a combination that served him well. Sarah would start school the following year, and Victoria looked forward to teaching her daughter as well. The years continued to pass in a blur of busy days and quiet evenings. The ranch prospered under Vaughn's careful management, and he was able to expand their land holdings and cattle herd. He hired several permanent hands to help with the work, good men who respected him and the life he and Victoria had built. Victoria continued teaching, becoming a beloved fixture in the Coloma school system. Her students went on to accomplish things their parents had never dreamed possible, several of them continuing their education beyond the basic schooling she provided. She was proud of each and every one of them, but her greatest pride was always her own family. James grew into a thoughtful young man who loved the ranch but also loved learning. He talked about going to university someday, maybe studying agriculture or business, and Vaughn encouraged him even though it meant his son might leave the ranch. "You have to let them follow their own path," Vaughn told Victoria one night when she worried about James leaving. "We can give them roots and wings, but we cannot clip those wings just to keep them close." Sarah was more interested in teaching than ranching, often sitting in on Victoria's classes during the summer when she was not in school herself. She had a natural way with younger children, patient and kind, and Victoria suspected she would make an excellent teacher someday. The twins, Thomas and William, were inseparable and wild, always getting into some kind of mischief. They loved the ranch with an uncomplicated joy that made Vaughn laugh. "Those two will run this place someday," he predicted. "They have cattle in their blood." Through it all, through the busy days and the endless work and the joys and challenges of raising 4 children, Victoria and Vaughn never lost sight of what had brought them together. Every single night, no matter what else was happening in their lives, Victoria read aloud while Vaughn listened. It had become more than just a ritual. It was a promise, a renewal of their commitment to each other, a reminder that they had built their relationship on mutual respect and genuine interest, on the simple act of sharing stories and ideas. Sometimes the children would join them, piling into the big bed to listen to their mother read. Those were Victoria's favorite nights, surrounded by the people she loved most in the world, sharing the gift of words and imagination. One evening when James was about 16, he asked a question that surprised them. "How did you two fall in love?" he wanted to know. "I mean, I know you met at a dance, but what made it real?" Victoria and Vaughn exchanged a look, a lifetime of understanding passing between them in that glance. "Your mother taught me to read," Vaughn said simply. "And in doing so, she showed me who she really was, smart and patient and kind. She did not mock me for not knowing something. She just helped me learn." "And your father accepted me as I was," Victoria added. "In a world where everyone wanted me to be someone different, he loved me for exactly who I was. He never asked me to change or pretend. Plus, she is beautiful and I could not resist her," Vaughn said with a grin, making Victoria blush even after all these years. James seemed satisfied with this answer. "I want that someday," he said. "Someone who accepts me as I am." "You will find it," Victoria assured him. "When you are with the right person, everything else falls away. What matters is how they make you feel, how they see you, how they value what makes you unique." The conversation stayed with Victoria for days afterward. It made her reflect on how far they had come from that first meeting in Coloma, from the nervous dance and the tentative courtship. They had built something real and lasting, something that had weathered difficulties and grown stronger over time. When James left for university in San Francisco in the fall of 1882, Victoria cried for days. But she was also proud, so incredibly proud that her son was pursuing his dreams. Vaughn held her while she cried, understanding her mixed emotions because he felt them too. "We did good with that boy," he said softly. "He is going to do great things." Sarah started teaching at the schoolhouse under Victoria's supervision when she turned 18, and the two of them made an excellent team. Having her daughter working alongside her was a joy Victoria had not anticipated. They would ride to town together, teach their classes, then ride home while discussing their students and sharing ideas for lessons. The twins, now 8 years old, were indeed as ranch-focused as Vaughn had predicted. They spent every free moment helping their father, learning everything they could about cattle and horses and land management. Vaughn was patient with them, teaching them the same way Victoria had taught him to read, breaking complex ideas into manageable pieces. In the spring of 1884, Vaughn came home with news that made Victoria's heart race. "I've been asked to speak at the Cattlemen's Association meeting," he said, both excited and nervous. "They want me to talk about ranch management and sustainable grazing practices." "That is wonderful," Victoria said, hugging him tight. "You absolutely should do it." "But Victoria, I will have to stand up in front of all those ranchers and talk," he said. "What if I sound stupid? What if I cannot find the right words?" "You will be brilliant," she assured him. "You know more about ranching than anyone I have ever met. And if you are worried about the words, we can write your speech together. We can practice it every night until you feel confident." So that is what they did. For weeks, they worked on Vaughn's speech in the evenings, crafting his years of experience and knowledge into clear, compelling language. Victoria would listen to him practice, offering suggestions and encouragement. Sometimes the children would listen too, giving their father an audience to help him overcome his nerves. The day of the speech, Victoria sat in the front row of the meeting hall, her hands clasped tight in her lap. When Vaughn stood up to speak, she could see the fear in his eyes. But then his gaze found hers, and she smiled at him, giving him a small nod of encouragement. He began to speak, his voice steady and clear, and Victoria felt pride swell in her chest. This man, who had once struggled to read simple sentences, was now addressing a room full of ranchers with confidence and authority. He spoke about responsible land management, about treating cattle humanely, about long-term planning versus short-term profits. The audience was rapt. When he finished, they gave him a standing ovation. Several ranchers came up afterward to shake his hand and ask for advice, treating him as an expert in his field. On the ride home, Vaughn was quiet, processing what had happened. Finally, he reached over and took Victoria's hand. "I could not have done that without you," he said. "Without everything you taught me, not just about reading but about thinking and expressing ideas. You made me into someone who could stand up there and speak with authority." "No," Victoria said firmly. "You made yourself into that person. You worked hard and learned and grew. I just helped with the words." "The words matter," Vaughn said. "They matter so much, Victoria, and you taught me that. You taught me that words have power, that stories and ideas can change lives. You changed my life." Victoria felt tears on her cheeks. Even after more than 20 years of marriage, he could still surprise her with the depth of his love and appreciation. That night, after the children were asleep, they lay in bed and Victoria picked up their current book, a new novel she had ordered from San Francisco. But before she could start reading, Vaughn took the book from her hands and set it aside. "I want to tell you something," he said, pulling her close. "Every night for over 20 years you have read to me. Every single night you have given me that gift. And I want you to know that those moments are the most precious of my life. Not just because I love the stories, though I do, but because it is time I get to spend with you, listening to your voice, being close to you, sharing something beautiful together." He paused, his eyes suspiciously bright. "When I asked you to marry me, I knew I was getting someone special, but I had no idea how special. You have made me a better man, Victoria. You have given me children who are smart and kind and capable. You have built a life with me that is richer than anything I could have imagined. And through it all, you have never stopped being exactly who you are. Read to me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Read to me tonight and tomorrow night and every night for the rest of our lives. That is all I want, you and me and the words between us." Victoria was crying openly now, but they were happy tears. She picked up the book with shaking hands and found their place. As she began to read, Vaughn settled against her shoulder, his arm around her waist, and everything felt right with the world. The years continued to pass, bringing changes and challenges, but also deep contentment. James graduated from university and chose to return to the ranch, bringing with him new ideas about breeding and marketing cattle. He met a young woman named Caroline at a church social, a schoolteacher like his mother, and fell deeply in love. Their wedding was a joyous occasion, and Victoria cried happy tears as she watched her son start his own family. Sarah married one of Vaughn's ranch hands, a quiet man named David who loved her gentle spirit and her dedication to teaching. They built a house on the edge of the ranch property, close enough to visit often but far enough to have their own space. Sarah continued teaching, even after she had children of her own, passing on the love of learning that Victoria had instilled in her. The twins, Thomas and William, stayed on the ranch as they grew into men, taking over more and more of the daily operations as Vaughn's hair turned gray and his joints started to ache on cold mornings. They were good ranchers, respectful of the land and the animals, carrying on the traditions their father had taught them. Victoria retired from teaching when she turned 55, ready to spend more time at home and with her growing number of grandchildren. She had taught hundreds of students over her career, had opened minds and changed lives, and she felt satisfied with that legacy. But she never stopped reading. If anything, retirement gave her more time to indulge her love of books. She would spend mornings on the porch with a novel and a cup of coffee, afternoons helping Sarah with lesson plans or playing with grandchildren, and evenings with Vaughn. And every night, without fail, she read aloud while he listened. It did not matter that they were older now, that their children were grown and their hair was gray. That ritual remained constant, an anchor in their lives. One evening, when Victoria was 60 and Vaughn was 62, he developed a bad cough that would not go away. The doctor came from Coloma and said it was pneumonia, that Vaughn needed to rest and let his body heal. For weeks, Victoria nursed him, hardly leaving his side. During those difficult days, she read to him constantly. When he was too tired to keep his eyes open, she would read anyway, knowing that her voice comforted him even in his exhausted state. She read all his favorite passages, the adventures and romances and histories that they had discovered together over the years. Slowly, painfully, Vaughn recovered. The cough faded and his strength returned, though he was never quite as robust as he had been before. The illness had aged him, made him more aware of his mortality. "I do not want to waste a single day," he told Victoria when he was finally well enough to sit up in bed. "We have been blessed with so many years together, but who knows how many more we have. I want to make the most of every moment." So they did. They took long rides around the ranch on sunny days, visited their children and grandchildren as often as possible, and spent quiet evenings by the fire with their books. They went to church socials and community gatherings, celebrated anniversaries and birthdays, and treasured every ordinary day as the gift it was. When Victoria turned 65, the family threw her a big party at the ranch. All 4 of her children were there with their families, plus what seemed like half the population of Coloma. Former students came to thank her for her teaching. Ranch hands came to pay their respects to the woman who had made Vaughn Wallace the man he was, and friends came simply because they loved her. The highlight of the evening was when James stood up to make a toast. "My mother taught me that learning is a lifelong pursuit," he said, raising his glass. "She showed me that intelligence and compassion are equally important, that books can open doors you never knew existed. But more than that, she showed me what real love looks like." He turned to look at his parents, his eyes warm. "My father once told me that my mother read to him every night, and that those moments were the foundation of their marriage. I did not fully understand what he meant until I was older, but now I see it. The way you two have built a life together, based on mutual respect and genuine affection, on accepting each other exactly as you are. That is something rare and precious. That is what I hope to build with Caroline. What Sarah has built with David. What the twins will someday find for themselves. Victoria cried, and Vaughn held her hand, and their children and grandchildren surrounded them with love. It was one of the happiest nights of Victoria's life, seeing the legacy they had built together, the family they had raised, the love they had nurtured for more than 4 decades. That night, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet again, Victoria and Vaughn climbed into bed as they always did. Victoria reached for their current book, but Vaughn stopped her. "I have something to say first," he said. "Today, listening to James speak, I was thinking about our life together. About that first night I asked you to teach me to read and how nervous I was. About the first time I asked you to dance and how beautiful you looked. About our wedding day and the day each of our children was born and every ordinary day in between." He cupped her face in his weathered hands. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Victoria Wallace. You took a rough cowboy who could barely read and showed him that there was more to life than just work and survival. You taught me about beauty and ideas and the power of stories. You gave me children who are smarter and better than I could have ever been on my own. You built this life with me, acre by acre, word by word, day by day." His voice grew husky with emotion. "I know I am not as young as I used to be. I know there will come a day when one of us has to say goodbye to the other, but until that day comes, I want you to keep reading to me. Every night, just like you have for all these years. Because that is when I feel closest to you, when I hear your voice bringing stories to life, when we are together in that space between the words and the world." Victoria was crying again, but she smiled through her tears. "Every night forever," she promised. "That was your request when we got married, and I intend to keep it." She opened the book and found their place, and as her voice filled the quiet room, Vaughn closed his eyes and listened. His hand found hers under the covers, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice, and they stayed that way until the chapter ended, and sleep claimed them both. The years that followed were gentle ones. Vaughn fully retired from the ranch, handing over the daily operations to Thomas and William while he served as an advisor when needed. He spent his days woodworking, making toys for grandchildren and furniture for the house, and riding the ranch boundaries just to enjoy the land he loved. Victoria continued to read voraciously, though her eyes were not as strong as they once were. She got spectacles from the traveling optometrist, and joked that at least now she looked the part of the educated woman everyone had always accused her of being. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in the spring of 1913, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. It was a smaller gathering than Victoria's birthday had been, but no less joyful. James gave a speech about lasting love. Sarah sang a song she had written for them, and the twins presented them with a beautiful leather-bound journal they had commissioned, filled with letters and memories from everyone who loved them. That night, reading through the journal together, Victoria and Vaughn marveled at the life they had built. So many people they had touched, so many lives they had influenced, all stemming from a chance meeting at a church dance and a simple request to learn to read. "You ever regret it?" Victoria asked softly. "Marrying a woman who was too bookish, too educated, too different from what was expected." Vaughn looked at her as if she had lost her mind. "Regret it? Victoria, you are the only thing I have never regretted. You were the best decision I ever made. The smartest thing I ever did was ask you to teach me to read, because it gave me a reason to spend time with you. And then asking you to marry me, asking you to read to me every night forever, building this life with you. It has all been the greatest joy of my existence." He kissed her then, a sweet, gentle kiss that held 50 years of love and devotion. "I would do it all again in a heartbeat," he whispered against her lips. Every single moment. Victoria believed him because she felt the same way. For all the challenges they had faced, all the judgment and criticism and hard times, she would not change a single thing. This life, this man, this family they had built together, it was everything. As they grew older still, their routines became even more precious. Morning coffee on the porch, afternoon visits from family, evening meals together, and always, the nightly reading ritual. Sometimes Victoria's voice would grow tired and scratchy, and Vaughn would read to her instead, his voice rough but steady as he worked through passages they both loved. The children worried about them, worried about what would happen as they aged and weakened. But Victoria and Vaughn faced the future with calmness. They had lived full lives, had loved deeply and been loved in return. Whatever time they had left, they would spend it together, reading and talking and simply being. On a warm evening in July of 1916, when Victoria was 73 and Vaughn was 75, they sat together on the porch watching the sunset paint the hills in shades of gold and amber. They held hands, comfortable in the silence, needing no words to communicate what they felt. "Read to me tonight?" Vaughn asked, as he had asked thousands of times before. "Always," Victoria promised, as she had promised thousands of times before. They went inside as darkness fell, climbed into the bed they had shared for more than 50 years, and Victoria picked up their current book. It was a collection of poetry, verses about love and nature and the passage of time. She found their place and began to read, her voice steady and clear despite her age. Vaughn listened with his eyes closed, a smile on his weathered face. Halfway through a particularly beautiful poem about enduring love, he squeezed her hand gently. "I love you," he murmured. "More than all the words in all the books we have ever read." "I love you too," Victoria replied, her heart full. "More than I could ever express, even with all those words." She finished the poem and moved on to the next and the next, reading until she felt Vaughn's breathing deepen into sleep. She set the book aside carefully, marked their place with the same faded ribbon she had used in her Shakespeare volume all those years ago, and settled down beside him. Through the open window, she could hear the sounds of the ranch at night. Cattle lowing in the distance, wind rustling through the grass, the soft hoot of an owl hunting in the darkness. The sounds of home, of a life well lived, of love that had endured. Victoria closed her eyes and let sleep take her, grateful for every moment, every word, every night they had shared. Tomorrow there would be more stories to read, more memories to make, more quiet moments of connection. But for now, this was enough. They were enough together in the darkness, wrapped in love and years and the endless magic of words. And true to their promise, every night for the rest of their lives, Victoria read to Vaughn and Vaughn listened, until they were both very old and their children had grown and their grandchildren had grandchildren of their own. They lived to see the world change in ways they could never have imagined, but through it all, that ritual remained constant. When Vaughn passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 82, Victoria was beside him, holding his hand as she had held it for nearly 60 years. She read to him that night as she always did, and though she did not know it would be the last time, some part of her felt the significance of it. The final words she spoke to him were from a favorite passage about love transcending death, and when she looked over and saw that he was gone, she felt both grief and gratitude. Grief that their time together had ended, but gratitude that they had been blessed with so many years, so many moments, so many nights of reading and love and perfect understanding. She lived another 3 years without him, surrounded by the family they had built together. Her children and grandchildren made sure she was never alone, never wanting for anything. But every night, she still read aloud, speaking the words into the darkness as if Vaughn could still hear her. And perhaps, in some way, he could. When Victoria died at 85, peacefully in her sleep just as Vaughn had, her children found her with a book still open on her chest. It was the same volume of Shakespeare she had been reading that day Martha had mocked her, the leather worn smooth by decades of handling. Inside the front cover, in Vaughn's careful handwriting, was an inscription they had never seen before. To my beloved Victoria, who taught me to read and in doing so taught me how to love. Read to me every night forever. Your devoted husband, Vaughn. Below it, in Victoria's elegant script, was a single line added years later. Forever kept, forever cherished, always yours, always listening. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, their graves marked with simple stones bearing their names and the years of their lives. But their true legacy was not in stone. It lived on in the 4 children they had raised, in the grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried their values forward, in the students Victoria had taught and the ranchers Vaughn had mentored. It lived on in the small library that Sarah established in Coloma in their memory, free and open to anyone who wanted to read. In the scholarship fund, James created to help young people pursue education regardless of their background. In the ranch that Thomas and William ran with the same respect for land and animals their father had shown them. Most of all, it lived on in the story their family told and retold, the story of a woman who loved books in a time when women were expected to know only sewing and housework, and the cowboy who loved her for it. The cowboy who asked her to read to him every night forever, and the woman who kept that promise until her last breath. Their great-granddaughter, a teacher like Victoria, would sometimes share the story with her own students. She would tell them about the power of acceptance and love, about how 2 people from different worlds had built something beautiful together through mutual respect and genuine affection. She would tell them that words matter, that learning matters, that being true to yourself matters. And sometimes, when she sat with her own husband in the evenings, she would pick up a book and read aloud, carrying on a tradition that had started more than 100 years before with a Shakespeare volume, a cowboy's request, and a love that proved stronger than any judgment or criticism the world could offer. In the end, that was the real story. Not just about reading or cowboys or the Wild West, but about 2 souls who found each other across the gulf of expectation and built a bridge of words and love that lasted a lifetime and beyond. They mocked her for reading instead of sewing, but the cowboy said, "Read to me every night forever." And in that simple request was contained all the love and acceptance anyone could ever hope to find. And she did read to him, every night forever, until forever ran out and became memory, became legacy, became a story worth telling to anyone who would listen. A story about love that valued the mind as much as the heart, about partnership built on mutual respect, about 2 people who chose each other every day for nearly 60 years. The ranch still stands, run now by the 6th generation of the Wallace family. The library still serves Coloma, filled with books for anyone who wants them. And somewhere in the family archives, carefully preserved, is that leather-bound Shakespeare volume with its inscription, a testament to a love story that began with words and never ended. Not really, because true love never does. It simply transforms, generation after generation, reminding us all that when you find someone who accepts you exactly as you are, someone who values what makes you different rather than trying to change it, someone who asks you to share your passions and makes them part of the life you build together, that is when you have found something real, something lasting, something forever, and that is worth more than all the perfectly sewn seams in the world.